Hello, so this is the second part of a video commentary on diction, aka word choice, in which I want to actually look closely at three different examples of different kinds of diction so we can get kind of concrete samples of what it actually means when we're talking about diction. So to review, diction is choice of words, especially with regard to correctness, clearness, or effectiveness. So any of the four generally accepted levels of diction: formal, informal, colloquial, which kind of means conversational, but there also might be some relation with colloquial to kind of regional type of speak. Certain words that might be used, for example, say in the South versus up in the North in New England, right? There's certain ways of speaking and conversing that slightly differ across regions, even though it's the same language. And then, of course, slang, which is kind of, street talk, it almost equates to a kind of code, and some people consider it a vulgarism, but it's certainly something that we all use, and it's a super familiar type of language, right? Because in order to use slang, the person that you're speaking with or writing to has to be in on the code, if you will. Any of these may be correct in a particular context, but incorrect in another, or when mixed unintentionally, right? So you don't want to use slang in an academic paper, which should be formal. Most ideas have a number of alternate words that the writer can select to suit his purposes, right? So you can express the same idea with a lot of different kinds of words. For example, children, kids, youngsters, youths, and brats all mean the same thing, but they have different evocative values. They all denote the same thing, but they all have different connotations. So here's some examples. The first one is poetic diction, right? So poetic style, a poetic choice of words. "'Tis the witching time of night, orbed is the moon and bright, and the stars they glisten, glisten, seeming with bright eyes to listen." And that's from Keats, A Prophecy, to George Keats in America, right? So there's lots of different ways this could be said, right? Instead of just saying it's 2 a.m. and the moon is shiny and round, and the stars are bright, and they look like eyes, right? It doesn't work the same way. These words are chosen in part to establish a certain kind of rhythm. They're established for the sound, for the way they sound in relation to one another. There's some rhyming as part of the word choice here. And there's a kind of glorified description bestowed on these things, which gives the description a different kind of associative power than if you just spoke simply and straightforward, right? And in some ways more ambiguous. It takes it out of the everyday language, such that through this description of these different things, we look at them in a different way and establish different associations, different pictures in our minds by this wording, as opposed to academic diction, such as this. Like Whitman, Miller participates in all three tenses simultaneously, or rather, the distinction is rendered meaningless in the full present. Miller's full present bears also remarkable resemblance to Spangler's pure present, an ahistorical and timeless mode in which classical and Indian cultures have no concern for the past, present, and future as arraying perspectives allegedly lived. Right, so this is very formal. It's using kind of jargon, ahistorical, the tenses to refer to past, present, and future modes, right? It's assuming that the reader has some understanding of academic English jargon. Orwell might argue that this is becoming overly ambiguous through its diction. Orwell might say that this is a kind of a poor choice of words, right? So when you say things like arraying perspectives, why not just say differing viewpoints? In a lot of ways that would be just as formal. And you can still use simpler language within academic diction, right? It's about leaving out slang. It's about using full, complete sentences, and establishing points fully before moving on to the next one. This is all part of diction, but specifically here, there's a kind of formality in the word choice you're not going to find slang in a properly written academic paper. You're not going to find the kind of symbolic speak that you would see in poetic diction, ideally, right? If somebody wrote an academic paper in rhyming verse, and their words were chosen based on how they rhyme, and how they glorify their subject, it would be kind of odd. Um, it might even be confusing, and the meaning would become even more lost than it already often is in the complexities of academic diction. And finally, another example. So these are just 3 examples. There's lots of examples, but I chose these 3 to look at. A kind of pulp diction, right? So you might have heard of Pulp Fiction. At least the movie Pulp Fiction was referring to a kind of cheap crime novel, cheap detective novel a lot of times. So this is kind of the language of a detective novel, and this is taken from Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. Being a copper, I like to see the law win. I'd like to see the flashy, well-dressed mugs like Eddie Mars spoiling their manicures in the rock quarry at Folsom alongside of the poor little slum-bred guys that got knocked over on their first caper and never had a break since. That's what I'd like. You and me both live too long to think I'm likely to see it happen. Not in this town, not in any town half this size, in any part of this wide, green, and beautiful USA. We just don't run our country that way. Right, so this is of course taken from a novel. It's establishing a kind of voice of somebody who's kind of streetwise for their time, knocking about with criminals. It's the voice of a detective, but it's somebody, who's down in the nitty gritty. So you, in this case, you actually get some slang, right? Maybe not slang we use much today, but like copper to refer to a policeman. A caper to refer to like a heist, a crime. Poor little slum-bred guys, like that's not exactly formal. It's not exactly poetic, at least not in the same way that we talk about poetic diction with Keats, right? Um, Flashy, well-dressed mugs, right? Mugs is like faces, uh, appearances, right? So that's slang, lots of slang here. It's chosen for kind of rougher language. It's meant to have a kind of rougher edge because that's the voice of the character speaking, and it's meant to have connotations and associations of the street and crime, and the the dregs of society, if you will, right? It's down there in the nitty gritty, right? So the point of this is 3 different examples, 3 extremely different ways of speaking, and the ways of speaking and the ways of writing in each of these cases is strictly adhering to their context. 3 different contexts, 3 very different kinds of speaking. So be very aware of the word choice that you use, not only in this class, but just kind of in all your classes, but in also just life. Be aware of the kind of context in which you're speaking and what kind of language is appropriate. And also be aware of the associations that your words evoke, right? I was struck when we did the Sedaris exercise with the paraphrasing and all that, and most people said that, or with the Kathy Park Hong as well. Looking at passages from there, that remember, if you remember that part of the exercise where you had to rewrite one of the sentences from one of those pieces, and almost everybody said that changing the words doesn't really change the meaning. But what I want to leave you with in this commentary is that changing the words on some level will always change the meaning because it changes the associations, right? So it might not change the denotations, it might not change what the words directly mean, but they create a different mood and a different sense of meaning and different connections to those words being used and to the content of those words. All right, so keep that in mind.